Okay. Oh, where am I? Where am I? I'm lost in the dark. Where am I? Where am I? I'm lost in the dark. Okay. Totally forgot to take the cover off my camera. All right. And it looks like captions are working. So, all right. Time for another chapter in The Temple and the Lodge. This one's a fairly long chapter, so I'm only going to do the one. And it finishes out the second section of the book and takes us to chapter 10 at the beginning of the third section, which is the origins of Freemasonry. So this one is Freemasonry, Geometry of the Sacred. So, and it ends with a few pictures, so we'll get to that. All right. Freemasonry is itself profoundly uncertain of its own origins. In the 4 centuries or so of its formal existence, it has endeavored, sometimes desperately, to establish a pedigree. Masonic writers have filled numerous books with efforts to chronicle the history of the craft. Some of these efforts have been not just spurious, but on occasion positively comical in their extravagance, naivete, and wishful thinking. Others have not just been plausible, but have opened important new doors of historical research. In the end, however, most such research has culminated in uncertainty. And not infrequently, it has provoked more question than it answered. One problem is that Freemasons themselves have too often sought a single coherent heritage, a single unaltered skein of tradition extending from pre-Christian times to the present day. In fact, Freemasonry is rather like a ball of twine ensnarled by a playful kitten. It consists of numerous skeins which must be disentangled before its various origins can be discerned. Masonic legend argues that Freemasonry, at least in England, descends from the Saxon king Athelstan. Athelstan's son is said to have joined an already existing fraternity of Masons, become an enthusiastic Mason himself, and by dint of his status, obtained a free charter for his brethren. As a result of this royal recognition, a Masonic conclave is supposed to have been convened at York, and the regulations drafted which formed the basis of English Freemasonry. Subsequent Masonic historians have exhaustively investigated this account. The consensus is that little or no evidence exists to support it. But even if it were true, it would still leave the most important questions unanswered. Where did the Masons allegedly patronized by Athelstan and his son come from? Where did they learn their craft? What was so special about it? Why should it have commanded from the throne the protection it reportedly did? Certain Masonic writers have sought to answer such questions by invoking the so-called Commacene Freemasons? According to these writers, there existed during the latter days of the Roman Empire a college of architects initiated into what would later be called Masonic mysteries. When Rome fell, the college, based at Lake Como, is said to have escaped and quietly to have perpetuated its teachings through successive generations. Its adepts during the Dark Ages are said to have found their way to various centers across Europe, including Athelstan's court. Neither of these two accounts is altogether implausible. Some sort of building program does appear to have been pursued during Athelstan's reign, to which York bears testimony. It was perhaps the most ambitious program of its sort in Europe at the time, and may well have involved some new or newly rediscovered technical or technological expertise. Moreover, early Bibles have been found dating from Saxon England, which depict God in the characteristically Masonic role of architect, and there is indeed some evidence that some sort of architectural college did exist on an island in Lake Como during the later days of the Roman Empire. It is perfectly possible that some of this college's teachings were preserved and later disseminated across Western Europe. But neither Athelstan and his son nor the Comacene Masons serve to account for one of the most salient aspects of later Freemasonry, the fact that it contains a major skein of Judaic tradition filtered through Islam. The corpus of legends central to Freemasonry, including, of course, the building of Solomon's Temple, derives ultimately from Old Testament material, both canonical and apocryphal, as well as from Judaic and Islamic commentaries upon it. It is worth looking at the most important of these legends, the murder of Hiram Abif, in some detail. The Hiram story is rooted in the context of the Old Testament. It figures in two books, 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. According to 1 Kings 5, 1 through 6, chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, quote, Hiram the king of Tyre sent an embassy to Solomon, having learned that he had been anointed king in succession to his father, and because Hiram had always been a friend of David, and Solomon sent this message to Hiram, I therefore plan to build a temple, so now have cedars of Lebanon cut down for me. And that end quote. There then follows I don't know, when it's text from someone, from another source, do I say it's a quote? Anyway, technicality, I guess. Doesn't matter. Then there follows a detailed account of the construction of the temple by both Solomon's builders and Hiram's. The levy of manpower raised for the project is said to be in the charge of one Adoniram, a variant spelling, it would appear, of the name of Hiram himself. After the temple itself is finished, the Israelite monarch wishes to adorn it with two great bronze pillars and other embellishments. Accordingly, in 1 Kings 7, 13 through 15, King Solomon sent for Hiram of Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, but his father had been a Tyrian, a bronze worker. He came to King Solomon and did all this work for him. He cast two bronze pillars. In 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 3 through 14, there is a slightly different account. Solomon then dispatched this message to Hiram, king of Tyre. I am now building a house for the name of Yahweh my God. So send me a man skilled in the use of gold, silver, bronze, iron, scarlet, crimson, violet, and the art of engraving too. He is to work with my skilled men. Huram, king of Tyre, replied, I am sending you a skilled craftsman, Haramabi, the son of a Danite woman by a Tyrian father. He is skilled in the use of gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, wood, in engraving of all kinds, and in the execution of any design. In its treatment of the temple's master builder, the Old Testament is cursory enough, but Freemasonry, drawing on other sources and or inventing some of its own, elaborates on the meager details and develops them into what, in the framework of a conventional organized religion, would constitute a full-fledged and self-contained theology. The story, when it appears in its final form, contains small variations in its particulars, similar to the variations in the Gospels, but its general tenor remains consistent from lodge to lodge, rite to rite, and age to age. Player won't load. What do you mean the player won't load? I don't know what that means. Okay. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Okay. The protagonist of the legend is usually known as Hiram Abief, or probably more accurately, Adoniram. Adoniram is manifestly derived from Adonai, or Adonai, the Hebrew word for Lord, in much the same way that Kaiser and Tsar are derived from Caesar. The master builder would thus have been Lord Hiram, though it has also been suggested that Hiram was not a proper name at all, but a title, perhaps denoting the king or someone connected with the royal house. Abief is a derivation from the word for father. Hiram Abief might thus be the king himself, the symbolic father of his people, or he might be the king's father, the ex-king or retired king, who might have abdicated after a stipulated number of years. In any case, the point is that he would appear to be connected by blood with the royal house of Phoenician Tyre, and is obviously a master versed in the secrets of architecture, the secret of number, shape, measure, and their practical application through geometry. And modern archaeological research confirms that Solomon's temple, as it is described in the Old Testament, bears an unmistakable resemblance to the actual temples built by the Phoenicians. It is even possible to go a step further. Tyrian temples were erected to the Phoenician mother goddess Astarte, who, subjected to a forcible sex change by the early church fathers, entered Christian tradition as the male demon Astaroth. In ancient Tyre, Astarte was known by the sobriquets Queen of Heaven and Star of the Sea, or Stella Maris, formula which were also, of course, hijacked by Christianity and conferred upon the Virgin. Astarte was worshipped conventionally on the high places, hilltops and mountains. Mount Hermon, for example, abounded with her shrines, and whatever her nominal allegiance to the God of Israel, Solomon was one of her worshippers. Hold on just a second. Yeah, everything seems to be working. Okay. Um, Thus, in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 3, Solomon loved Yahweh. He followed the precepts of David, his father, except that he offered sacrifice and incense on the high places. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 4 through 5, is even more explicit. When Solomon grew old, his wives swayed his heart to other gods, and his heart was not wholly with Yahweh his God as his father, David's, had been. Solomon became a follower of Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians. Indeed, the famous Song of Solomon itself is a hymn to Astarte and an invocation of her. And then it gives part of the song, I assume. Come from Lebanon, my promised bride, come from Lebanon, come on your way. Lower your gaze from the heights of Amana, from the crests of Senir and Hermon, or Hermon. All of which raises questions about Solomon's temple, constructed by a Phoenician master builder. Was it indeed dedicated to the God of Israel, or was it dedicated to Astarte? In any case, Hiram, adept of architecture, is brought by Solomon from Tyre to preside over the building of the temple, so that Solomon's temple is ultimately, strictly speaking, Hiram's temple. In reality, of course, the immense manpower involved in so ambitious an undertaking would have consisted primarily, if not exclusively, of slave labor. In Masonic ritual and tradition, however, at least some of the builders are depicted as free men or Freemasons, presumably Tyrian professionals who are paid for their work. They are organized into 3 grades or degrees: apprentices, fellows, and masters. Because they are so numerous, Hiram cannot possibly know all of them personally. In consequence, each grade or degree is given its own word. Apprentices are given the word Boaz, after one of the 2 immense brass pillars or columns supporting the temple's porch. Fellows are given the word Jachin, Jachin, after the second pillar or column. Masters are given, at least initially, the name Jehovah. Each of these 3 words is also accompanied by a particular sign or placement of the hands and a particular grip or handshake. When wages are distributed, each worker presents himself to Hiram, gives the word, sign, and grip appropriate to his rank, and receives the appropriate payment. One day, as Hiram is praying in the precincts of his nearly completed edifice, he is accosted by 3 villains, fellows according to some accounts, apprentices according to others, who hope to obtain the secrets of a superior degree not yet their due. Hiram having entered through the western door, the villains block his exit and demand from him the secret word, sign, and grip appropriate to a master. When he refuses to divulge the information they desire, they attack him. Accounts vary as to which blow he receives at which door, as well as which implements inflict which wound. For our purposes, it is sufficient that he receives 3 blows. He is struck on the head with a maul or a hammer. He is hit with a level on one temple and with a plumb on the other. Historically, accounts vary also as to the sequence of these injuries. As to which inaugurates the assault and which constitutes the coup de grace, the first wound is received at either the north or the south door. Trailing blood, which leaves a distinctive pattern on the floor, Hiram staggers from exit to exit, receiving an additional blow at each. In all accounts, he dies at the east door. This is a modern lodge. This, in a modern lodge, is where the master stands to officiate. It is also, of course, where the altar of a church is always placed. Mortified by what they have done, the 3 villains proceed to conceal the master's body. According to most accounts, it is hidden on a nearby mountainside, buried under loose earth. A sprig of acacia, the sacred plant in Freemasonry, is uprooted from an adjacent clump and thrust into the grave so as to make the soil look undisturbed. But 7 days later, when 9 of Hiram's subordinate masters are searching for him, one of them, climbing the mountainside and seeking a handhold to pull himself upwards, seizes the sprig of acacia, which comes away in his grip. This, of course, leads to the discovery of the murdered man's body. Realizing what has happened and fearing that Hiram may have divulged the master's word before he died, the 9 masters resolve to change it. The new word, they agree, will consist of whatever any of them should chance to utter as they disinter the corpse. When Hiram's hand is clasped by the fingers and the wrist, the putrefying skin slips off like a glove. One of the masters exclaims "Mac Bene," or any of several variants thereof, which in some unspecified language is said to mean the flesh falls from the bone, or the corpse is rotten, or simply the death of a builder. This becomes the new master's word. Subsequently, the three villains are discovered and punished. Hiram's body, exhumed from the mountainside, is reinterred with great ceremony in the precincts of the temple, all the masters wearing aprons and gloves of white hide to show that none of them has stained his hands with the dead man's blood. As we have said, over the past 250 years, alternative versions of the story have varied slightly in the sequence of events or in some of the specific details. There are also variations in Solomon's supposed conduct throughout the affair. Sometimes his role is heavily emphasized, sometimes it's played down. But in their essentials, all versions of the legend conform to the outline delineated above. What lurks behind the narrative is another question, which lies beyond the confines of this book, belonging more properly to studies in anthropology, comparative mythology, and the origin of religions. In the wake of Sir James Fraser's pioneer work in the Golden Bough, commentary has proliferated. Some scholars, as well as certain Masonic writers, have argued that the whole of the Hiram story, like many other narratives in ancient myth, and for that matter in the Bible too, was a deliberate distortion, a veil intended to mask one of the most archaic and widespread of rituals, that of human sacrifice. It was certainly not uncommon in the Middle East of biblical times to consecrate a building with a sacred corpse, a child, a virgin, a king, or some other personage of royal blood, a priest or priestess, a builder. Tomb and shrine were often one and the same. In later epochs, the victim would already be dead or would be replaced by an animal, but in the beginning, a human being was often deliberately killed, ritually sacrificed, in order to sanctify a site with his or her blood. The story of Abraham and Isaac is only one of numerous indications that the ancient Israelites subscribed to such practices, and indeed residues of their tradition persist well into Christian times, with churches frequently being erected on the burial sites of saints, or saints being buried, if not actually killed, in order to consecrate churches. In his novel Hawksmoor, published in 1984, Peter Ackroyd depicts a series of early 18th century London churches being built on sites of human sacrifice. What some readers and reviewers regard as the fantasy of a horror story rests, in fact, on a long-established principle. At the time of which Ackroyd is writing, Freemasons were almost certainly privy to this principle, even if they never actually implemented it. Okay. In any case, and whatever the atavistic residues concealed within it, the core of the Hiram story is not a latter-day fabrication, but a narrative of very great antiquity. As we have noted, there is little enough of it in the Old Testament proper, but there are elaborations and variations among the earliest of the Talmudic legends and Judaic apocrypha. Why it should become so important later, why indeed Hiram should come to assume the proportions of a veritable Christ figure, is of course another question. But by the Middle Ages, the architect or builder of Solomon's temple had already become significant to the guilds of operative stonemasons. In 1410, a manuscript connected with one such guild mentions the king's son of Tyre and associates him with an ancient science said to have survived the flood and been transmitted by Pythagoras and Hermes. A second, admittedly later manuscript, dating from 1583, cites Hiram and describes him as both the son of the king of Tyre and a master. These written records bear testimony to what must surely have been a widespread and much older tradition. Such a tradition may account for the parallels between the king of Tyre tradition, the king of Tyr's son and Athelstan's both royal princes, both reputed architects, master builders, and patrons of Masons. It is not clear precisely when the Hiram story first became central to Freemasonry. Almost certainly, however, it contributed in some measure to the institution's beginnings. Looking back to Sir William Sinclair's Rosslyn Chapel and the head of the murdered apprentice, it is possible to see in his wound an injury identical to the one allegedly inflicted on Hiram, while the woman's head in the chapel is known as the widowed mother. Here, then, are motifs from the Hiram story long antecedent to modern Freemasonry. According to later Freemason... Excuse me. According to later Freemasonic writers, the skull and crossbones was long associated with both the Templars and with the murdered master. For how long it had in reality been so remains unknown. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the skull and crossbones was used as a device to denote Hiram's grave, and by extension, the grave of any master mason. As we have seen, legend has it that Bruce, on exhumation of his grave, was said to have been found buried with his leg bones crossed beneath his skull. The skull and crossbones were also an important part of the regalia of the Freemasonic degree known as Knight Templar, and it figures prominently among the graves at Kilmartin and elsewhere in Scotland, along with other specifically Masonic emblems. In Freemasonry today, the death of Hiram is ritually reenacted by every aspirant to the so-called third degree, the degree of Master Mason. But there is now one crucial addition. The Master is resurrected. To go through the third degree means to die ritually and be reborn. One acts the part of Hiram, one becomes the Master and experiences his death. One is then, according to the phraseology employed, raised a Master Mason. There is an interesting echo of this rite in an episode pertaining to the prophet Elijah in 1 Kings 17, chapter 17, verse 17 through 24. On a visit to Sidon, near the city gate, Elijah finds a widow gathering firewood and is taken into her house. During his sojourn with her, her son, the son of a widow, becomes ill and dies. Elijah stretched himself on the child 3 times, crying for God's succor, whereupon the soul of the child returned to him again and he revived. I don't know what it means by stretched himself on the child 3 times. What does that mean? There is one curious footnote. If anybody knows what that phrase means, please let me know. I have no idea. Stretched himself on the child 3 times. There is one curious footnote to this survey of the Hiram story. Until the 18th century, it was kept rigorously secret and seems to have been part of the arcane lore confided only to initiated brethren. Around 1737, however, in France, paranoia about Freemasonry and its secrecy set in and has continued to the present day. Police raids ensued. Certain individuals appear to have infiltrated lodges in order to report on the activities conducted there. A few Freemasons defected or leaked information. As a result, there began to appear the first in an ongoing series of exposures, all of which have proved signally anticlimactic. Nevertheless, they cast the Hiram legend more or less into public domain, rendered it familiar to non-Freemasons, and divested it of most of its portentous mystique. In 1851, the French poet Gérard de Nerval, having returned from a tour of what was then an exotic Middle East, published a massive 700-page memoir, Voyage en Orient. In his In this opus, Nerval not only recounted his own experiences, some of them semi-fictionalized, he also included travelogue, commentaries on manners and mores, legends he had encountered, folk tales, and stories he had heard. Among the later, there is the fullest, most detailed, and most evocative version of the Hiram story ever to appear in print, either before or after. Nerval not only recited the basic narrative as it is outlined above, he also divulged for the first time, to our knowledge, a skein of eerie mystical traditions associated in Freemasonry with Hiram's background and pedigree. What is particularly curious is that Nerval makes no mention of Freemasonry whatsoever, pretending that his narrative is a species of regional folk tale, never known in the West before. He claims to have heard it orally recited by a Persian raconteur in a Constantinople coffee house. In another writer, such apparent naivete might be plausible, and there would be no particular reason to query his assertions. But Nerval was part of a literary cycle which included Charles Nodier, Charles Baudelaire, Théophile Gautier, and the young Victor Hugo, all of whom were steeped in arcana and esoterica. It is not clear whether Nerval was himself a Freemason. He may not have been. He may, in the murky subterranean world of occult occult sects and secret societies, have had other allegiances. But there can be no question whatever that he knew what he was doing, that he knew his narrative, even if he did not hear a version of it in a Constantinople coffee house. Oh, even if he did hear a version of it. Uh, was not a quaint Middle Eastern folk tale, but the central myth of European Freemasonry. Why Nerval chose to divulge it, and why he divulged it in the manner he did, remains a mystery, rooted in the complex politics of the mid-19th century French occult revival. But his weird, haunting, and evocative retelling of the Hiram legend is the most complete and detailed version we have, or are likely ever to have. The Architect as Magus. The Hiram legend represents a strand of Judaic tradition in Freemasonry. In certain of its versions, however, including Gerard de Nerval's, it also incorporates Islamic elements and influences, and we have seen Nerval claim to have obtained his version from Islamic sources. How then did it find its way into the heart of medieval Christian Europe, and why should it have been so important to the builders of Christian religious edifices? Let us begin by considering the second of these questions. Judaism forbade the making of graven images. Islam inherited and perpetuated that taboo. Under both Judaism and Islam, a cultural heritage evolved which was inimical to the representational art to any depiction of natural forms, including, of course, that of a man himself. The kind of decoration one associates with Christian cathedrals is not to be found in a synagogue or the mosque. In part, this interdict derives from the fact that any attempt to depict the natural world, including the human form, was deemed to be blasphemous, an attempt by man to compete with God as creator, even to usurp and displace God as creator. God alone was held to possess the prerogative of creating forms out of nothingness, creating life out of clay. For man to create a replica of such forms and a replica of life out of wood, stone, pigment, or any other substance was a trespass on the divine prerogative, and of necessity a parody or travesty of it. But there was also a deeper theological justification behind this apparently over-literal dogma, a justification which overlapped and may even have been influenced by ancient Pythagorean thought. Pythagorean. Um, God in both Judaism and Islam was one. God was a unity. God was everything. The forms of the phenomenal world, on the other hand, were numerous, manifold, multifarious, and diverse. Such forms bore witness not to the divine unity, but to the fragmentation of the temporal world. If God was to be discerned in the creation at all, it was not in the multiplicity of forms, but in the unifying principles running through these forms and underlying them. In other words, God was to be discerned in the principles of shape, determined ultimately by the degrees in an angle, and by number. It was through shape and number, not by representation of diverse forms, that God's glory was held to be manifest, and it was in edifices based on shape and number, rather than on representational embellishment, that the divine presence was to be housed. The synthesis of shape and number is, of course, geometry. Through geometry and the regular recurrence of geometric patterns, the synthesis of shape and number is actualized. Through the study of geometry, therefore, certain absolute laws appear to have become legible. Laws which attested to an underlying order, an underlying design, an underlying coherence. This master plan was apparently infallible, immutable, omnipresent, and by virtue of those very qualities it could be construed, easily enough, as something of divine origin, a visible manifestation of the divine power, the divine will, the divine craftsmanship. And thus geometry in both Judaism and Islam came to assume sacred proportions, becoming invested with a character of transcendent and immanent mystery. Towards the end of the 1st century BC, the Roman architect Vitruvius had enunciated that what were to become some of the most basic premises for later builders. He had recommended, for example, that builders be organized into mutually beneficial societies or collegia. He had insisted, quote, "Let the altars look to the east," as of course they do in Christian churches. Most important still, he had established the architect as something more than a mere technician. The architect, he said, quote, "should be a skillful draftsman, a mathematician, familiar with the historical studies, a diligent student of philosophy, acquainted with music, familiar with astrology." End quote. For Vitruvius, in effect, the architect was a species of magus, conversant with the sum of human knowledge and privy to the creation's underlying laws. Paramount among these laws was geometry, on which the architect was obliged to draw in order to construct temples, quote unquote, by the help of proportion and symmetry. Whew. In this respect, too, then Judaism and Islam were to converge with classical thought. For was not architecture the supreme application and actualization of geometry, an application and actualization that went further than painting and rendered geometry three-dimensional? Was it not in architecture that geometry in effect became incarnate? It was thus in structures based on geometry with no embellishment to distract or deflect the mind that God's presence was to be accommodated and worshipped. The synagogue and the mosque, therefore, were both based not on decoration but on geometric principles and on abstract mathematical relationships, and the only ornamentation allowed in them was of an abstract geometrical kind. The maze, for example, the arabesque, the chessboard, the arch, the pillar or column, and other such pure embodiments of symmetry, regularity, balance, and proportion. During the Reformation, the taboo against representational art was to be adopted by some of the more austere forms of Protestantism. This was particularly so in Scotland, But medieval Christianity, under the hegemony of the Catholic Church, had no such inhibitions or prohibitions. Nevertheless, Christendom was quick to seize upon the principles of sacred geometry and utilize them to augment its own attempts to embody and do homage to the divine. From the period of the Gothic cathedrals on, sacred geometry in architecture and in architectural adornment went hand in hand with representational art as an integral component of Christian churches. In the Gothic cathedral, indeed, geometry was the single most important factor. As we have noted in the building of Rosslyn Chapel, the construction of any such edifice was conducted under the direction of the so-called master of the work. Each such master would devise his own unique geometry with which everything that followed had to harmonize. A study of Chartres was revealed during the course of its construction, or has revealed during the course of its construction, the imprint of 9 separate masters. Okay, I am going to finish this page, and then there's a good stopping point to take a quick break. Most masters were essentially proficient craftsmen and draftsmen whose skills were wholly technological. Some of them, however, 2, it is believed, out of the 9 at Chartres, were obviously versed in something more. Their work reflects a metaphysical, spiritual, or in the language of Freemasonry, speculative character which attests to a high degree of education and sophistication, attests to men who were thinkers and philosophers as well as builders. As we have noted, one manuscript dating from 1410 speaks of a science whose secrets were revived after the flood by Pythagoras and Hermes. From references of this kind, it is clear that certain masters, at least, had access to Hermetic and Neoplatonic thought, well before such thought during the Renaissance came into vogue in Western Europe. But prior to the Renaissance, such thought, heterodox as it was and drawing on non-Christian sources, would have been extremely dangerous to its adherents, who were therefore compelled to secrecy. In consequence, an esoteric tradition of initiated masters would have arisen within the guilds of operative stonemasons. Here, then, were the seeds of what was later to be called speculative Freemasonry. Within this esoteric tradition of initiated masters, sacred geometry was of paramount importance, a manifestation, as we have seen, of the divine. For such masters, a cathedral was more than a house of God. It was something akin to a musical instrument, an instrument tuned to a particular and exalted spiritual pitch, like a harp. If the instrument were tuned correctly, God himself would resonate through it, and his eminence would be felt by all who entered. But how did one tune it correctly? How and where did God specify his design requirements? Sacred geometry provided the general principles, the underlying laws. But there was one Old Testament context in which it was believed God had very precisely and specifically instructed his worshippers, had drawn up his own blueprints. This context was the building of Solomon's temple, and thus the building of the temple came to assume supreme importance for the stonemasons of the Middle Ages. Here God had actually taught the practical application of sacred geometry through architecture, and his chief pupil, Hiram of Tyre, was therefore adopted as the model to which every true master builder must aspire. Okay, I am going to take a quick break. We'll have 10 pages left plus the picture pages, which is like 3 or 4 pages, maybe more. And that'll finish out this section. But, quick break, do some deep breathing, wake myself up, and refill my glass. So, I will be back in a few minutes. Okay, let's get back to it, shall we? We've got 10 pages to go here. Um, so the hidden knowledge. This is why the Hiram story came to assume the importance that it did. There remains the question of how it and its various embellishments find their way into the heart of Christian Europe. How, for that matter, did sacred geometry as a whole, compounded by Pythagorean, Vitruvian, Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Judaic, and Islamic thought, find its way to the West? In order to answer these questions, one must look at the periods in history when such bodies of teaching might have been most influentially transmitted and assimilated, periods when Christianity was most exposed to alien influences and sometimes deliberately, sometimes by a form of osmosis, absorbed them. The first such period was in the 7th and 8th centuries, when Islam, impelled by the militant energy characteristic of a new faith, swept through the Middle East, traversed the coast of North Africa, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, overwhelmed the Iberian Peninsula, and advanced into France. The subsequent Islamic rule in Spain reached its apotheosis in the 10th century, and thus coincides with Athelstan's reign in England. Although there is no documentation on the matter, it is certainly possible that some of the principles of sacred geometry and architecture filtered northwards from Spain and France. The armies of Islam may have been halted by Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers in 732, but ideas are always more difficult to repulse than armies. In 1469, Ferdinand of Aragon married his cousin Isabel of Castile. From this union modern Spain was born. In an access of apostolic zeal, Ferdinand and Isabel embarked on a program of purification, whereby their united domains were to be systematically purged of all alien, that is, Judaic and Islamic, elements. What ensued was the era of the Spanish Inquisition and the auto da fe. As Carlos Fuentes has said, Spain at this point banished sensuality with the Moors and intelligence with the Jews, and proceeded to go sterile. But during the 7.5 centuries between the Battle of Poitiers and the reign of Ferdinand and Isabel, Spain was a veritable repository for esoteric teaching. Indeed, the first major esotericist in Western tradition was the Majorcan Raymond Lull, or Lully, whose work was to exert an enormous influence on later European developments. But even apart from Lull, it was accepted that individuals seeking esoteric or mystical initiation had to make a statutory pilgrimage to Spain. In Parzival, Wolfram von Eschenbach claims his story to have derived ultimately from Spanish sources. Nicholas Flamel, probably the most celebrated of the early Western alchemists, is said to have learned the secrets of transmutation from a book obtained in Spain. For 7.5 centuries, then, Spain was to remain a source of esoteric inspiration. From Spain, material continued to filter into the rest of Europe, sometimes in a trickle, sometimes in a flood. But the Spanish influence, important though it might be, was soon to be eclipsed by other, more dramatic contacts between Christendom and its rival faiths. The first of these was, of course, the Crusades, during which tens of thousands of Europeans in the Holy Land became steeped in the very creeds they had marched to extirpate. During the Crusades, the Sicilian court of the Hohenstaufen Emperor Friedrich II became a veritable clearinghouse for Judaic and Islamic currents of thought. The Templars were another major conduit, perhaps the major conduit for such currents. Although nominally Knights of Christ, the Templars in practice maintained cordial relations with both Islam and Judaism, and are even said to have harbored ambitious plans for reconciling Christianity with its two rival faiths. The Templars built extensively. Using their own teams of masons, they constructed their own castles and preceptories. Templar architecture was usually Byzantine in its characteristics, reflecting influences from beyond Rome's sphere of control. As we have seen, two graves of Templar master masons were found at Athlit in Israel, probably the oldest known Masonic graves in the world. The Templars sponsored their own guilds. They also acted as patrons and protectors for other guilds of craftsmen and stonemasons, and appear on occasion to have become members of such guilds themselves. On occasion, too, skilled artisans would be taken in as associates of the temple. They would live in self-contained villages attached to preceptories and enjoy many of the order's privileges, including exemption from tolls and taxes. In Europe, moreover, the Templars were self-appointed guardians of the roads, ensuring safe passage for pilgrims, travelers, merchants, and builders. Given the broad spectrum of activities, it is hardly surprising that principles of sacred geometry and architecture should find their way to Western Europe under Templar auspices. But if the Templars were a conduit for such principles, they could only have been so for a limited period of time, for no more and probably less than the 2 centuries of their existence. Nor, as we have stressed repeatedly, must the Templars be inflated into something they were not. Some of the order's functionaries may indeed have been as well educated as, say, their equivalents in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Some may indeed have been versed in the arcana of sacred geometry and architecture, but the majority of the Templars were mere rude soldiers, as untutored and unsophisticated as most other nobles of their age. From their superiors, such men might have learned that the guilds of operative stonemasons possessed technological secrets meriting respect, but they would not have known what these secrets were, still less have been capable of understanding them. With the official dissolution of the order, moreover, much was undoubtedly lost. In Scotland, particularly, refuge Templars cut off from their former superiors would have been left with only empty forms to observe. They might have regarded the art of building with deference, but its significance for them would have been more symbolic and ritualistic than practical. They are hardly likely to have understood much about it. Indeed, any Templars surviving in Scotland would probably have been like certain later forms of Freemasonry, mechanically perpetuating a corpus of traditions and observances without really appreciating what they signified. Oh, I just noticed my captions quit. Hold the phone. Yep. Um, so give me a second here and I will get those back up and running. Ooh, excuse me. Uh, okay, that should take care of them. If there was a connection between the Templars and the guilds of operative stonemasons in Scotland, it would in any case have exhausted itself by the 15th century, would have worn thin and become diluted. But just at that point there was to be a transfusion of fresh inspiration from elsewhere, which regenerated the application of sacred geometry to architecture and imparted a new impetus to both. In 1453, Constantinople and the last surviving remnants of the old Byzantine Empire fell to the Turks. The result was a massive influx into Western Europe of refugees together with the treasures accumulated during the previous 1,000 years of Byzantine libraries. Texts on Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, uh, Gnosticism, Kabbalism, astrology, alchemy, sacred geometry, all the teachings and traditions which had originated in Alexandria during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries and been constantly augmented and updated. And then in 1492, as we have seen, Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain inaugurated a ruthless extirpation of Islam and Judaism from their domains. This, too, produced an exodus of refugees who found their way eastwards and northwards, bringing with them the entire corpus of Iberian esotericism, which had been filtering piecemeal into Christendom since the 7th and 8th centuries. The impact of these developments was overwhelming. It transformed Western civilization. Scholars and historians concur that the influx of ideas from Byzantium and Spain was probably the single most important contributing factor to the cultural phenomenon now known as the Renaissance. The Byzantine material found its way initially to Italy, where men such as Cosimo de' Medici immediately pounced upon it. Academies were established to study and propagate it. Translations, the earliest and most famous by Marsilio Ficino, were commissioned and disseminated. Exegesis by Pico della Mirandola, for instance, were written and similarly diffused. From Italy during the next 100 years, a wave of esotericism was to spread across the rest of Europe. Sacred geometry, now regarded as a form of talismanic magic, was applied no longer just to architecture, but in the works of Leonardo and Botticelli, for example, to painting as well. It was soon to suffuse other arts, including poetry, sculpture, music, and particularly the theater. Not that architecture was thereby diminished. On the contrary, it acquired an even more exalted status than before. The dissemination of Neoplatonism, the syncretic mystical teachings which had coalesced in immediately post-Christian Alexandria, imparted a renewed significance to the older classical thought of Plato himself. And in Plato, Renaissance scholars, excitedly seeking relevant connections, found a principle of crucial to the later crystallization of Freemasonry. In Plato's Timaeus, there appears the earliest known equation of the creator with the architect of the universe. The creator in the Timaeus is called tekton, meaning craftsman or builder. Architekton thus denoted master craftsman or master builder. For Plato, the architekton crafted the cosmos by means of geometry. As we have seen, the corpus of esoteric material from Constantinople found its way initially to Italy. Of the corpus from Spain, 40 years later, much also reached Italy, but much found its way to the Low Countries, the Spanish dominions of Flanders and the Netherlands. Here it generated a Flemish Renaissance which paralleled the Italian, and by the beginning of the 16th century, the strands originating in Italy and the Low Countries had converged under the patronage of the House of Guise and Lorraine. Thus, for example, the first French edition of the seminal Corpus Hermeticum, published in 1549, was dedicated to Charles de Guise, Cardinal of Lorraine, brother of Mary de Guise, who married James V of Scotland and bore Mary Queen of Scots. Corpus Hermeticum, I might actually have a translation of that. I'll have to look. The House of Guise and Lorraine was already steeped in esoterica. Indeed, Cosimo de' Medici's interest in Byzantine esoterica had owed much to the encouragement of his scholarly colleague René d'Anjou. Duke of Lorraine in the mid-15th century, who had spent time in Italy and fostered the transplantation of Italian Renaissance thought to his own domains. Sheer geographical proximity dictated that material from Flanders should find its way into those domains as well. By the early 16th century, then, and despite their ostensible Catholicism, the Guise and Lorraine families had become assiduous sponsors for works of European esotericism. From them, via Mary de Guise's marriage to James V via the Scots Guard, and via such families as the Stuarts, Settons, Hamiltons, Montgomerys, and Sinclairs, it was to be carried back to Scotland. Here, where the old Templar legacy had prepared the ground and guilds of operative stonemasons under Sinclair patronage were evolving their own mysteries. It was to find fertile soil, and here we find Mary de Guise writing of Sir William Sinclair that, quote, "We bind us to the said Sir William in likewise that we shall be leal and true masters to him, his counsel and secret shewen to us we shall keep secret." Wow. Difficult to read that. That Middle English with the weird spellings. All right, the hidden knowledge in France and England. We've got a ways to go. The Guise and Lorraine families were, as we have seen, ruthlessly ambitious. Not only did they come within a hair's breadth of gaining the French throne, they also had their eyes on the papacy, and would almost certainly have attained it had not their intrigues and their blunders in French politics compromised their credibility and drained their resources. In order to facilitate their designs on the throne of St. Peter, they undertook to present themselves as a bulwark of Catholic Europe, defenders of the faith, against the reformation of the rising tide of Protestantism in Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries. In consequence, they adopted and pursued a public policy of fervent Catholicism, often fanatical in intensity. One manifestation of this policy was the notorious Holy League, an alliance of Catholic princes and potentates dedicated to eradicating Protestantism from the continent. To outsiders, the Holy League seemed a testimony to Guise and Lorraine's piety. To the Guise and Lorraine families themselves, however, the Holy League was simply a matter of political expediency, the blueprint for a structure intended ultimately to supplant or subsume the Holy Roman Empire, and of course, there was little point in wresting control of the papacy if the papacy were powerless. In order to render it worth the taking, the papacy had to be strengthened and, so far as possible, its old medieval hegemony over Europe restored. Unfortunately for the Guise and Lorraine families, the policy and public image that furthered their designs on the continent were counterproductive in Europe. Both England and Scotland had by then become Protestant. For England in particular, the primary threat was soon to be embodied by Catholic Spain, whose ruler, Philip II, married Mary Tudor 4 years before her death in 1558. Anything even faintly papist was anathema in England, and the Holy League was perceived as a menace, not just to Protestantism on the continent, but in the British Isles as well. By virtue of their zealous support for the Church, Francois de Guise and his family became, in English eyes, ogres, exceeded in terms of menace only by the Spanish monarch. Esoteric thought was enthusiastically taken up in England. It was embraced by poets such as Sidney and Spenser. For example, the figures in Arcadia and the Fairy Queen. It was also embraced by Marlowe and by Francis Bacon. But to the extent that it was associated with Catholic houses on the continent, it could not be dealt with publicly or explicitly. By the way, I have a whole bunch of stuff by Francis Bacon, so we'll be reading some of that. I don't know if I have Marlowe. Um, it was often treated obliquely, allegorically. Its existence was largely subterranean, confined to small scholarly cabals, circumscribed aristocratic circles, and what we would now call secret societies. These organizations were often militantly anti-papist and actively opposed to the blatant political and dynastic ambitions of the Guise and Lorraine families on the continent, but they were simultaneously steeped in the corpus of esoteric material which had filtered back to Scotland from the Guise and Lorraine families, and there found such fertile soil. The career of the Scottish philosopher Alexander Dixon exemplifies the way in which such material, amidst the complicated political cross-currents of the period, was transmitted. Born in 1558, Dixon graduated from St. Andrews in 1577 and spent the next 6 years in Paris. On his return, he published a book dedicated to Queen Elizabeth's favorite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. This book drew heavily on the early work of the prominent Italian esotericist Giordano Bruno, who's I do have some of his stuff too, whose defiance of Rome was to lead him to the stake in 1600, and who, before his death, nominated Dixon as his successor. And yet, in 1583, despite his close association with Bruno, whom Rome regarded as an arch-heretic, and despite moving in circles very close to the throne of Elizabeth, Dixon was in Paris, vociferously proclaiming his support for Mary Queen of Scots and associating with personages connected with the Holy League. And though his friendship with Sidney appears to have been genuine enough, he was also a spy, supplying the French ambassador with secret English documents, including some which Sidney had drawn up. By 1590, Dixon was in Flanders, conducting clandestine missions for Catholic potentates. In 1596, he was rumored to be working with James Beaton, Scottish ambassador to France, and with Charles de Guise, Duc de Mayenne, then head of the Holy League. Also connected with this group was Lord George Seton, whose son Robert was created Earl of Winton in 1600 and married Margaret Montgomery, an alliance which was to lead along a cadet line of the family to the earldom of Eglinton. Beaton, formerly Archbishop of Glasgow, had been conspiring with the Guise and Lorraine families since at least 1560. In 1582, while Dixon was still in Paris, Beaton and Henry, Duc de Guise, were plotting to invade England with an army supplied by Spain and the papacy. On the night before her execution in 1587, Mary Queen of Scots named Beaton and Henry de Guise among her executors. Or executors. Executors. All of a sudden I'm blanking on which is which. Alexander Dixon typifies the way in which esoteric and political allegiances have become entangled, sometimes working in tandem, sometimes diametrically opposed. Dixon, however, was a relatively minor figure compared with England's real arch-magus of the age, Dr. John Dee. And yet Dee, too, had to thread a precarious path between warring factions, Catholic and Protestant interests, the aspiration to esoteric knowledge, and the more immediately pressing demands of state. Nor did he escape as unscathed as Dixon. Although his Protestant allegiances were never, like Dixon's, in doubt, he came repeatedly under suspicion, was once imprisoned, and was consistently harassed. And I do have John Dee and Edward Kelly, all of their works. Well, maybe not all, but I have a lot of them. So we'll be reading some of those too. Born in Wales in 1527, physician, philosopher, scientist, astrologer, alchemist, Kabbalist, mathematician, diplomatic emissary, and spy, Dee was one of the most dazzlingly brilliant men of his age, the epitome of the so-called Renaissance man. He was widely believed to have provided Shakespeare with the prototype for Prospero in The Tempest, and his influence, both during his lifetime and afterwards, was enormous. It was Dee who gathered the diverse strands of esoterica and synthesized them in a fashion that prepared the way for later developments. It was through Dee and his work that England during the 17th century was to become a major center for esoteric studies, and it was Dee who, in effect, set the stage for the emergence of Freemasonry. As a young man still in his 20s, Dee was already lecturing at continental universities, Louvain, for example, and Paris, on principles of geometry. During the critical period of Guise and Lorraine plots and counterplots, he was moving unchecked about the continent, establishing currency for himself in all quarters. In 1585 and 6, he was in Prague, which, under the liberal, pacifist, and supposedly eccentric Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, had become the new center for esoteric studies. He enjoyed the patronage of the emperor and returned with material which would enable England in that respect to supplant Prague. Among his most important later disciples were to be Inigo Jones and Robert Flood, who as a young man worked as tutor in mathematics and geometry to the then Duc de Guise and his brother. I'm pretty sure I have some Robert Flood too. Dee was instrumental in disseminating Vitruvian principles of architecture and geometry. In 1570, moreover, 15 years before his journey to Prague, he published a preface to an English translation of Euclid. In this preface, he extolled the supremacy of architecture among the mathematical sciences. He spoke of Christ as our heavenly archmaster. Excuse me. He echoed Vitruvius's portrait of the architect as a species of magus. And here's a passage here. I think that none can justly account themselves architects of the sudden, but they only who from their child's years ascending by these degrees of knowledges, being fostered up with the attaining of many languages and arts, have won to the high tabernacle of architecture. Whew. Man, those weird spellings are really rough to read. And in a passage of crucial relevance to later Freemasonry, he invoked Plato. And here's the passage, and the name of architecture is of the principality which this science hath above all other arts, and Plato affirmeth the architect to be master over all that make any work. During most of Dee's lifetime, esoteric thought in England had, as we have seen, remained underground or had been taken up only in certain rarefied circles. In Scotland it had prospered, but because of Mary de Guise and Mary Queen of Scots, everything Scottish was suspect in English eyes. In consequence, Dee and other English adherents of esoterica could not yet forge the crucial link with developments in Scotland. By the beginning of the 17th century, however, the situation had dramatically changed. In 1588, Philip II's Armada had been decisively defeated, and Spain was seen as less and less of a threat to English security. The possibility of the Guise and Lorraine families establishing a foothold in Britain had receded with the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the assassination a year later of the young Duc de Guise, and his brother had effectively cut the heart out of the family, crippling its dynastic and political ambitions. By 1600, it was an all but spent force, and the Holy League, too, was crumbling. Moreover, esoteric thought was no longer associated so exclusively with the houses of Guise and Lorraine, or even, for that matter, with Catholic interests. One of its most important new patrons was, as we have seen, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who declared himself to be neither Catholic nor Protestant, but Christian. He never persecuted Protestants. He became increasingly estranged from the papacy, and on his deathbed he refused the rights of the church, the last rites of the church. By 1600, in fact, esoteric thought had begun to flourish energetically and publicly in Protestant principalities. In the Netherlands, in the Palatinate of the Rhine, in the kingdoms of Württemberg and Bohemia, it was soon to be used as an instrument of propaganda against Rome. Thus purged of any taint of the Guise and Lorraine families, it could safely break surface in England. In 1603, moreover, when the Guise and Lorraine families were no longer able to exploit the situation, James VI of Scotland, a Stuart monarch with Guise-Lorraine blood, became James I of England. At this point, from the perspective of posterity, one can virtually hear a click as the requisite historical components at last slip into place. With the union of England and Scotland under a single sovereign, noble Scottish families began to play a role in English affairs, and two of them, the Hamiltons and the Montgomerys, crossed the Irish Sea to establish the Ulster plantation. Through such families, something of the old Templar mystique and that of the Scots Guard began to seep into England and Ireland, and the new king, it must be remembered, was a patron and possibly a member of the guilds of operative stonemasons. He brought with him from the north their traditions as well as the esoteric heritage of his Guise-Lorraine forebears. All of these elements conjoined to the work of John Dee and his disciples were to coalesce into philosophical, or as it is called, speculative Freemasonry. All of them had now become not only respectable and legitimate, but associated with the throne as well. The old Templar sword and the trowel of the master builder were to become, in effect, adjuncts of the Stuart arms. There was to be one further current of influences before Freemasonry crystallized into its modern form. On the continent, as we have noted, esoteric teaching was now being promoted by Protestant princes, especially in Germany, and was being used as an instrument of propaganda against the twin bastions of Catholicism. The papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. It had by now begun to call itself Rosicrucianism, and Francis Yates had labeled this phase of its dissemination the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. Anonymous pamphlets began to appear, extolling an invisible college or clandestine confraternity allegedly derived from the mythical founder Christian Rosenkreutz. These pamphlets militantly attacked the new Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. They extolled the spectrum of esoteric teaching. They forecast the imminent advent of a new golden age in which all social and political institutions were to be regenerated, and an epoch of utopian harmony was to begin, free of the tyranny, both secular and spiritual, of the past. In England, the chief exponent of Rosicrucian thought was John Dee's disciple, Robert Flood, who, along with Francis Bacon, was among the conclave of scholars commissioned by King James to produce an English translation of the Bible. But while Flood may have endorsed Rosicrucian ideas, they certainly did not originate with him, nor is he believed to have had any hand in the authorship of the anonymous Rosicrucian manifestos. Those manifestos are now thought to have been composed in part, if not in their entirety, by a German writer from Württemberg, Johann Valentin Andrea, and they were thought to have been associated preeminently with the court of Heidelberg of Friedrich, Count Palatine of the Rhine. In 1613, Friedrich married Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of James I of England. 4 years later, the nobles of the Kingdom of Bohemia offered Friedrich the crown of their country, and his acceptance of it precipitated the 30 Years' War, the most bitter and costly conflict to be fought on European soil prior to the 20th century. In the early years of the fighting, most of Germany was overrun by Catholic armies and German Protestantism was threatened with extinction. Thousands of refugees, among them the philosophers, scientists, and esotericists who embodied the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, fled to Flanders and the Netherlands, and thence to the safety of England. To facilitate the escape of these fugitives, Johann Valentin Andrea and his colleagues in Germany created the so-called Christian unions. The unions, which constituted a species of lodge system, were intended to preserve intact the corpus of Rosicrucian doctrine by organizing its proponents into cells and smuggling them to safe havens abroad. Thus, from the 1620s on, German refugees began to arrive in England, bringing with them both Rosicrucian ideas and the organizational structure of the Christian unions. By James I's time, as we have seen, a lodge system had already been established within the guilds of operative stonemasonry and had begun to proliferate across Scotland. By the end of the 30 Years' War, a system that had filtered down to England in its general structure, it seems to have coincided more felicitously with that of Andrea's Christian unions, and it proved more than ready to accommodate the influx of Rosicrucian thought. German refugees thus found a spiritual home in English Masonry, and their input of Rosicrucian ideas was the final ingredient necessary for the emergence of modern speculative Freemasonry. In the years that followed, developments proceeded on two fronts. The lodge system consolidated itself and proliferated further, so that Freemasonry became an established and recognized institution. At the same time, certain of the individuals most active in it formed themselves into an English version of the Invisible College of the Rosicrucians, a conclave of scientists, philosophers, and esotericists in the vanguard of progressive ideas. During the English Civil War and Cromwell's Protectorate, the Invisible College, now including such luminaries as Robert Boyle and John Locke, remained invisible. In 1660, however, with the restoration of the monarchy, the Invisible College became, under Stuart patronage, the Royal Society. For the next 28 years, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, and the Royal Society were not just to overlap, but virtually to be indistinguishable from one another. Okay, that is the end of that chapter. So now we've got some pictures to show real quick, and then we will wrap it up for the evening. So, pictures 20, 21, and 22. Roslyn Chapel, 3 of a series of symbolic figures at the extreme east of the chapel. The photograph on the right shows an angel indicating the breast and right calf, relevant to later Freemasonic ritual. Okay, and then the second is an upside down angel that looks like it's tied up, and the third is also an angel that is kneeling. So, all right. Try to do each one of these separately. So there is the one with the hand on the breast and the calf. And then the upside down one and the kneeling one. The kneeling one almost looks like it's got curled horns, to be honest. Maybe that's just the hairstyle, but it almost looks like curled horns. Not like a not like an American mountain sheep, but more like a water buffalo, almost. What it looks like to me. I don't know if it's supposed to, but that's what it looks like to me. All right, so the next one, picture 23. Christ as a divine architect from the mid-13th century Bible Moralici. Okay, and that is, I'll try to get it as close as I can. I'll have to scan up, but there we go. And then this last one, the Creator as divine architect of the universe as depicted in the early 14th century Holcomb Bible. This concept originates with Plato's Timaeus. So that is this one. See all those figures along the top. All angels, it looks like. Creator as architect. Try to get my fingers back out of the way. There we go. Now I'll back up so you can try. I can try to get you the whole picture in one. You'll get both of them. Oh, all right, and I think there's like one more. Yes, the gravestone of a Templar Mason from the Knights Templar castle of Athlit, Israel. The grave must predate the abandoning of the castle by the order in 1291. And it has the hammer and square on it. The whole thing. There we go. And now a little more detail. There's the hammer, there's the square. All right. So that, as you can see, takes us to the origins of Freemasonry. And the earliest or Freemasons will be the first chapter. I believe there are 19 chapters in this book, plus the appendices, which we probably won't read. They look like just lists of stuff. So yeah, we'll see how long these other chapters are. If I can manage to do 2 at a night, I will, but doubtful. This next one is it's 13 pages. Well, 12 pages. Actually, you know what? 21 pages to do 2 chapters. I could do 2 chapters the next time. So that'll get us through the book a little bit quicker. I'm enjoying the book, but I know it's probably a bit dry for everybody. So I'm wanting to get through it. So yeah, I'll plan on trying to do 2 chapters on Sunday. Yeah, Sunday. So, all right, and I will be getting back to gaming on Saturday. So, we'll see you tomorrow night for the next Star Wars reading. And let's see. Who have we got? What the heck is Sleeping Dogs? I've never heard of it. Mr. Blitzer 79 is playing Sleeping Dogs. Cepeda is playing World of Warcraft, and Count BB is playing Fallout 4. Let's go look at some Fallout 4. We'll go ahead and do a little raid. I don't know. I don't even know how many people are watching right now. But we'll raid with what we've got. So I will see you over there.
What's there to be divided about? Everyone wants
Awesome. Thank you so much, Papa God, for the shout out there for being up there live. And thank you so much for rating too. That's too good for me. Thank you so much for rating me and hanging out. And yeah.
Let's find a prototype.
Great. You will be eliminated. Oh, this guy's Francis Adele.